Hello, and welcome to our second video. We're going to be looking at some more chapters of Kuntz in this, up until the point where you guys read. In chapter 10, she looks at women's natural moral superiority. Women were really romanticized as being naturally morally superior, and many women were happy to be cloistered from this silly world, what they saw of men going out into honor and ambition, that they would much rather do what they saw as the more meaningful tasks of creating people, adults, raising them from young infants through into their adulthood. We also see this transition from house to home in the way that we speak. If you look at older pieces of literature like Edgar Allan Poe, I don't know if you've heard of the terribly gruesome, like most of his stories, The Fall of the House of Ushers. Not to go into the story too much, but a young girl, they believed she was dead, and so they put her in a casket. And she wasn't truly dead. And while she was wonderful and perfect and pure and sweet in every way, she went crazy inside of this tomb. And when they finally realized that it was a mistake and let her out, she was just a mess. Anyway, the fall of the House of Ushers is the point. It's not about a building falling down, right? Now when we talk about a house, it's about a building. We see it also in Shakespeare, a plague on both your houses. When Mercutio was just recently trying to get between Romeo and Tybalt in this fight that they were having, and he accidentally becomes stabbed, mortally wounded, and he falls down and says, "A plague on both your houses." Had nothing to do with buildings. It had to do with people. Houses were really important. Houses were your lineage, your ancestors, all the descendants that would come after you, and it evoked this sense of antiquity, honor, and dignity. It was really, and it was also considered a public institution. And this is key, that houses were public institutions. It was about everyone who would ever come before or after you. And then we see this transition into the word home. Home, sweet home. On our way home. It's this feeling of love and joy. Home is this private institution, right? It's only your immediate family also. We're starting to lose the significance of kinship and extended family. Immediate family, warmth, care, love. It's this sanctuary and refuge from the cruelties of the, quote, world out there. It's very much a private institution. So as we see this transition, and this transition from house to home, and from family as public versus family as private, is really significant. And you can see it in this art, that here we have this family going on, and I'm not sure who the young lady is on the left, but we can definitely identify the mother and father gathered around the piano, singing with their singing songs with their children, in perfect harmony, no doubt. We see some grandparents, the legacy, but they're off to the side. They're not a part of the important part of the action. They're gathering themselves warm by the fire. And what's really important, where the love and the attention is happening, is between the parents and their children. Very interesting piece of art. It says a lot of what the values were of the time. All right, and so then we have this new idea of manhood that emerges from this time. Men are no longer seen as part of as the head of the family. Instead, they are part of it. There's a lot of emphasis that's put on the primacy of the spousal relationship. The wife is seen as the primary heir. If anything should happen, it's no longer the firstborn son or all the children equally, but wife is the primary heir. And no domestic violence is permitted at all. Before, again, it was considered a lower class vice. Now it's illegal. It is something that the lower class are really it's just a plain old vice. No one wants anything to do with it. And then this nuclear family begins to really grow in importance. Manly virtue in the 18th century was really considered should finish this one. As part of the citizen model, right? Men were citizens first. They were in public life. But as we're starting to exit the 18th century and enter the 19th century, in these 1800s, this is when we start to get really sentimental about the family. A man is most a man when he is dedicated to his wife, his children, and his role as breadwinner. He's only in public life because he needs to support and sustain his family. So this new womanhood was coming along too. Women entertained, middle-class wives at least. They entertained, they gave moral instruction, they taught arts. All of this, we must keep in mind too, was only possible because there were so many lower-class women who did so much of the work for them around the house. And this freed them for all of the emotion work that they sought to do. There were also increased educational opportunities for women due to their moral influence as mother. People started to say, hey, if these people are shaping young children from the very beginnings of their lives, maybe they should have more education themselves. But women refused to call themselves workers, even if they earned wages. Here's corset woman again. I don't know how she made it into my presentations twice. But we have this idealized model of the provider, homemaker model, excuse me, which gave working class families grounds for improving welfare provisions and for raising wages. Women were also seen, very interestingly, as asexual at this point. Remember, we were talking about women's sexual purity being a really important part in the last video. Now it's just that women have no sex drive at all. This had pros and cons. One, and I don't know if it's hard for us to realize this in our contemporary American context, but not sex itself, but pregnancy and birth was very dangerous, actually. We forget how dangerous it is because we have so many medical advances, but before this could really be a life or death situation. And so having another child was not to be taken lightly. But if women were seen as asexuals, not having a sex drive, as good women were seen as not having a sex drive, this gave them a way out of sex so that they never needed to worry about those sorts of things. But it did make a con, is that it made female sexuality seem very strange, very weird, not of the norm. You would be concerned if your wife was trying to get you in the mood. And men also mirrored this. They wanted to respect the asexuality of their wives, and so around their wives they were very non-sexual with them. Men cared a lot less about their future children and really cared about the wife and the pregnancies in birth. So the husband-wife bond trumped all the other familial bonds. That of their parents, that of their children, very focused on the husband-wife bond. Men ended up frequenting a lot of prostitutes. They were very guilty about this, but heaven forbid that they should ever show passion toward their wives. They didn't want to subject them to those sorts of things. And it ended up creating this terrible dichotomy where good women you could not have good sex with good women. These were two mutually exclusive things. And so your wife being a good woman, you would never have good sex with her. And these prostitutes then who you had good sex with were implicitly bad women. And so we have these things built in that are starting to emerge here. So a question, this is question 1BQ1. Again, if you're new to the discussion boards, please check out the discussion grading rubric so that you know how involved you're supposed to be as far as getting sources and that sort of thing. It gives a really great outline of what's expected of your responses. But this is question 1B, a meeting. It's going to be in week 1, the second of week 1. Question 1, 1BQ1. Briefly, what are some of the meanings of sex and virginity of the past for men and women? Just address that very briefly. More importantly, and put more of your time into this part, what does it mean for you today? Are there differences for men and women as far as sexuality goes and expectations of that? And whether you agree with these expectations or not, these differences that might be expected of sex and virginity for men and women, but do they exist and do you agree with them? Go ahead and unpack that one in our module discussion forum 1BQ1. Okay, and that brings us to chapter 11, Victorian marriage. If you want to read a little bit more on Victorian marriage, everything from homosexuality to gender roles to heterosexuality and just sexuality in general. Disorderly Conduct is the name of a book by Carol Smith Rosenberg, which really explores this more deeply. Really good book if you're interested in this, to go more into this. But so marriage was this pivotal experience for people, and married love was the primary focus of their emotions, obligations, and satisfactions. It had become the social institution par excellence at this point. There was a real focus on romantic love, which weakened the notion of separate spheres. First, one of the things it did is it made people unsure who to marry. They weren't sure if this person that they were dating, while they might be a nice guy or a nice lady, maybe they weren't ideal. Maybe they weren't for me, right? We're starting to focus more on emotions and feelings and not so much on roles. Men also could not really enforce their masculine authority if they were also expected to adore their wives. So this was a problem. Also, it weakened the moral sphere because women were seen as naturally more moral. This was part of their the gender essentialism. One of the things that this notion of gender essentialism gave women was an idea that they were naturally morally superior to men. And so this, at first, necessitated that they stay in the private sphere and avoid the public sphere. However, suddenly women about this time start to realize, no, if we are morally superior, we can't have these moral homes in this immoral world. We need women's presence out there, and we need to enter. The temperance movement is a great example of women who mobilized because of a dedication to domesticity. A lot of people write temperance off as this, was it just a bunch of women who couldn't have a good time? They didn't understand about alcohol. And they wanted to ruin everyone's good time. But actually, what was going on is they saw a lot of people who were otherwise good people spending a lot of money on alcohol and driving their family into debt, seeing the women and the children were suffering because of this, or domestic violence being brought out through drunkenness. And so suddenly temperance was this very pro-women's, very pro-family, very pro-domestic sphere movement that women became involved in because they wanted to keep home, women, and children out of danger. Okay, and this brings us into the 20th century, chapter 12. We went going from a sentimental sort of marriage to a sexual marriage. This is the first time that we get to see that sexuality has an important role to play within marriage. Women in the 20th century were looking to liberate themselves personally and not really politically. Aside from suffrage, there wasn't really a lot of feminist movements that happened on the political level. A lot more about just identity, expressing yourself, and that sort of thing, and being able to be just free. We also see a transition from courting into what people call calling or coming to call. So before, women and men would court in public places. It would be the two of them privately together, but they would be in a public place. So there was kind of society was sort of chaperoning them at this point. And then it transitioned into calling or coming to call. And then on the left column, we look at calling. These were at girls' homes, so girls would extend the invitation. So a girl would go up to a guy and say, would you like to come to call tonight on my house? And he would say yes or no. And her family would provide financially. They would bring out cookies and lemonade and give them a semi-private location. Usually the front porch was a place where men and women came to call. They could have their private words, but their bodies would not be in private. And her family would ultimately be supervising. If anything were to go wrong, her parents would be but a shout away and everything would be just fine. And then around 1910 or 1920, we have this phenomenon of dating, which really comes into full force by 1920. Generally, this is away from either the boy's family or the girl's family. And it also switched in who initiated. It used to be with calling that girls would ask because they provided. It was at their home. They were hosting. However, when around 1920, boys were the only one who really had significant opportunities for wage work. Girls didn't really have any sort of disposable income. And so it would be really rude for a girl to go up to a guy and say, take me on a date, because he was going to be financially expected to cover it. Because girls had no money, had no work at this point. And so the boys would always ask the girl. Because of this, there was no family supervision on dates either. Which could potentially be dangerous. It gave women more freedom, for sure, but less protection from male advances. And there was also the issue that women still sometimes say they struggle with today with, if he pays, what is he owed? What do I owe him at this point? What does he expect? And so these sorts of issues did not come up in the context of coming to call, and they do in dating. What we do have now is that women are suddenly getting to be sexy again. And from the silver screen to just their day-to-day lives to the wife that you share a bed with, she gets to be sexy again. You don't need to worry about prostitutes and that sort of thing. And it's interesting that men are also, again, they stop frequenting prostitutes at this point. When we read Aziz Ansari's book, he goes into a little bit about what was happening as far as monogamy goes there. But anyways, women get to be sexy starting in the early 20th century. Sexuality gets to earn its place within marriage as a natural part of marriage, as a good of marriage. And good marriages were supposed to have good sex. This was important. It wasn't that you were abusing your wife or using her as an outlet, or suddenly it might be your wife bringing you into the bedroom. It was suddenly considered a good and healthy thing for couples to married couples to enjoy. But as we see, marriage now has ever increasing expectations to live up to. It was one thing to have this emotional partner sort of thing, but not need the sexual gratification from them. But now we see more and more things being stacked on top of marriage. And we also see an interesting transition. Before, submission was an important part of the wife's role. She was to submit to her husband, recognize that he was the authority in charge. But now women here have a new expectation, not of submission, but of sex appeal, to be beautiful and to be attractive to their husband. Don't let him catch you in curls. Make sure that you've got on your nice heels and pearls and that sort of thing. The joke about 1950s women scrubbing toilets in their pearls was not all too far off the mark, because sex appeal was supposed to be a very important aspect of being a wife. In the context of dating, this was had its own important things that it did. Unlike the last century, both parties were encouraged to act upon their sexuality. So both women and men were allowed to initiate any sort of advances, but women were expected to put up the limits of whatever those limits were. Men were allowed to keep going and going and going, but women were the ones who were supposed to be the careful guardians of their own virginity. Basically, was however virginity was defined by different generations, which is it's not always the strict vaginal sex that a lot of contemporary people draw those boundaries of. Now that we have these new marriages, we also have new questions to go with them, no doubt. So happiness really increases in relevance to a good marriage. People say that you should be married and happy. Suffering in your marriage is not a sign of a good marriage. Conservatives correctly fear that happiness is perhaps not the most stable foundation for marriage. Homosexuality is again revisited. The same-sex affection that was tolerated in the previous century is now marked as unhealthy and deviant in the current 20th century. However, homosexual subcultures are generally well tolerated. So that's again, always the compromises happening here, but they're happening in different ways. And all of this love and joy and happiness ultimately ends up bringing sadness. So sad. So the increasing importance of married love in society really ended up people putting so much weight on their marriage. This is who you spend your time with. This is who you spend your energy on, that sort of thing. It caused a decrease in the importance of other social relationships that people had. And women were a lot more isolated. They tended to be a lot more isolated. Generally, if they're one of the two spouses were not working, it was the woman. Kin and friendship networks are not as relevant in the past, and sometimes they are more distant. So suddenly women find themselves being a lot more isolated. The mother-child bond and the sibling bonds were less valued. And even before marriage, people tended to socialize in pairs rather than crowds at this point. So people are used to these dyads, and then suddenly when your husband's off at work, what do? The house is clean, there are no kids yet, or maybe the kids are at school and you're just kind of left there. So fewer parents are, and also another thing to add to this is fewer parents are living with their married children at this point. Multi-generational households are starting to leave as far as their frequency and their commonness. And it really is, we're starting to focus a lot more frequently on the nuclear family. That tends to be what the household unit is now. We also have this dropping birth rate. As you can see, it's really going down as this chart goes. This is the rates per 1,000 population. So you see going down, down, down. A lot of births that happened in the past were not due to the fact that people had a stronger value for children or any of those sorts of things. It just had to do with the fact that contraception was not very good. And so this is the vast majority of what is explained in this dropping birth rate as contraception gets better. And we see the baby boom. That was a time when there was a booming economy. More women were at home, which gave them a more incentive to have children. But yeah, other than this baby boom, it's a pretty steady decrease over the century. This also gave rise to the eugenics movement, which is a really scary thing. Lower class, they believe that the lower classes were creating more eugenics. I'm sorry, I should clarify what this is. Eugenics is about the idea that there are better genes and better genetics in some people and some populations than in others. And this is the same sort of thing that fueled Nazi Germany, right? The extermination of one group in favor of the proliferation of another. So the eugenics movement happened with the United States. People within this movement started saying that the lower classes were creating more people than the middle and the upper classes. This concerned them. So a lot of men were sterilized at this point, involuntarily, from the belief that they could not fulfill the male breadwinner role. They believed that they weren't smart enough. They weren't physically capable of doing it and were involuntarily sterilized. 75% of women who were sterilized because they were sex delinquents. In other words, they weren't fit mothers in some way, or they were too loose of who they were having sex with. Then this sort of very physical and direct attack on populations of people fell into great social disfavor, thankfully. But then the eugenics movement, very interestingly, changed into marriage counseling. And it's founded the whole marriage counseling movement. They said, okay, well, if we can't sterilize certain people, we need to at least keep the right kind of people married if we want them to procreate. So they were really focusing on getting middle and upper class families together and keeping them together and encouraging them to have children. Marriage counseling today is a totally different ball of wax, but it started from this really scary and terrible eugenics movement in the 20th century. But it is something now. So if you ever need marriage counseling or look to seek marriage counseling, don't worry. It's a whole different ball game these days. All right, and then in chapter 13, Kuntz looks at the Great Depression and World War II. There was a bad depression in marriage as well. Although, if you look at statistics, the divorce rate really fell during the Depression. This was mainly, though, because people could not afford to live on their own. So there was a real problem. People just couldn't afford to, so they would stay together even if they're unhappy. This is why you see a quick little peak afterwards. But this is a really important reminder that it's methodologically problematic to assume that a low divorce rate means that marriages are happier or that society is more stable, or that a higher divorce rate means that we're falling apart. And here's the divorce rate. As you can see, there was a small dip in the divorce rate around the Great Depression time, but it rebounded right after that. And then after 1940s, you see what's called the divorce revolution. But then that kind of stabilized again as well. And then we have kind of just this really slow and steady uptick. There are highs and lows that usually correlate with booms and busts, either going on socially or the economy and that sort of thing. But generally, we have a pretty gradual a steady divorce rate that's happening. All right. So gender and women. This is from the Great Depression to World War II. It was really interesting to see women entering the workforce. In the Great Depression, pretty much anyone who could work did. 24% of women worked at this point. They did so to survive, right? It wasn't a matter of this job being fulfilling or liberating. Most jobs that women did were extremely low paid. White women would usually get jobs in teaching or in factories. Black women would get jobs as domestic workers. And just as there's photos of a few other groups here as well too. But usually, just as an aside, blacks were roughly 90% of the non-white population in 1950. So that's when we look historically at racial experiences, we tend to discuss black experience and white experience. This tends to give us the biggest sort of demographics to look at. But yeah, so blacks typically, and black women have always worked historically, whether there are booms or busts in the economy. And this has been a historical experience of black women in the workplace. There's just been this precedent of black women in the workplace. But women really lost ground as higher pay and high status positions went to men. And men's jobs varied a lot more in status. So while all women's were pretty much universally underpaid, even if perhaps teaching might have had a bit more status, really low pay jobs. But men had a variety of experience, at least if they were white men. White men could be working really blue collar manual work, or they could be working as accountants in these really high paying white collar jobs. Black men, though, were pretty much universally kept out of more high paying jobs. But men who lost their jobs, especially if their wives worked, really lost their sense of masculinity. As this sign shows, I know 3 trades, I speak 3 languages, I fought for 3 years, I have 3 children, and no work for 3 months, but I only want 1 job. So there is this real sense of men needing work. And even today, men's identity tends to be tied up more in their work than women's. It's not across the board. Not, every individual will fall into this, but that tends to be the case. But this was even more so magnified back then because of the gender expectations that society had. And this really caused a high level of family tension. Tension from an emasculated father who could not work was confused with the tension of a working wife, right? So a lot of men ended up getting angry at their wives for working. That's what they believed. But really, they were angry at the fact that they couldn't work. And so it was displaced anger on their wife. And the government really handled this poorly, too. They really exacerbated the situation. They had 2 tiers of social provision: entitlement for breadwinners, for men, and charity for single and widowed women. So men, regardless of the number of dependents they might have had, were given a higher entitlement wage, and then women were given a lower charity wage, regardless of the number of dependents they might have had. There's just sexism was built into the system at this point. But even the words entitlement and charity have a certain power to these words, right? Entitlement is a justice, having a right. Men were seen as having a right to work. And so they were given more because of it. And charity is being cared for, right? So men are still entitled. That's this whole justice. Like, I am providing for my family. I can still be the breadwinner. Whereas women have classically been dependent upon men for money. And so now with this whole idea of charity, they're shifting their dependence from men onto the state. So women were still given this idea of being cared for. But this time the state is the employer or the provider. And this brings us to the current question. We have, to what extent does gender shape our view of men and women in the workforce today? Where are some of the places we see increasing equality, and where does significant inequality remain? Any suggestions for how we might fix this? And this is question 1BQ2. Right, and then onward we go. Things, though, changed a lot for World War II and working women. It was a whole different ball of wax. Women were invited into the workforce in droves, and they came. A lot of men were off at the war, and they were off in Europe, and they were in Asia, and they were fighting really hard. And so not only were jobs vacated, but also whole new industries opened up. People needed to make bombs and airplanes and all sorts of military equipment. And so suddenly we see them not only having these male jobs, but also commanding male wages. We see a whole new, really important sets of skills that these women are getting, from welding to explosives to making fighter jets. Like, it's amazing. African American women also had access to these middle class jobs, which was something that they had not had in the history of America. Someone commented that it was Hitler, not Lincoln, that freed the slaves, commenting on the access that African American women got during this time frame. And society was really encouraging of women going into the workforce. There was a lot of propaganda to encourage women to come in, if they using all sorts of ideas to connect people. Do the job he left behind, as you see in the upper left corner, and then Rosie the Riveter, classic icon of women coming into the workforce during World War II. You see these beautiful, fantastic, beautifully photogenic women. So they're not losing their femininity by entering the workforce by any means. They're happy and jovial and beautiful in their jobs. Little dolls were given to girls to encourage them to consider professions. And in the bottom right one, we see how some of the ideas that it's not traditional for women to work, and the response would be, it's a tradition with us, mister, and would not look at women's work as something that was new, but would tie it back to the pioneers in colonial times when women did work all the time. So not only saying this is a new thing, rather instead framing it as something that women have always done. Really fascinating to look at all this. And women really ended up enjoying their work. At first, when they entered the workforce, they thought it was temporary. This was just something that they would do. But many of them came to really enjoy the work, the money, and perhaps most importantly, the autonomy that this gave them. One woman said a really kind of a sad commentary. Sending women back into the home was like, quote, putting a chick in its shell. To wrap your head around that, think about what all that is, the images. There's like this sense of reversion, of going back, of backstepping, right? Of destroying your spirit, your heart, your mind. All of that is there. And that's what the women experienced. The Great Depression associated women's work with men's failure, but World War II was a much more positive experience for women going into the workforce. And the GI Bill was great for pulling up lower class white men into the ranks of the middle class. Women and blacks also had access to the GI Bill, but there were some actually specified limits as to what they could do, and some were just kind of de facto of who would be offered what type of people would be offered what type of job, and that sort of thing. And then family, that brings us to the new individualism. Family has a new sort of understanding now in this booming economy. Americans really began to embrace individual, not familial values, so that the family existed for its members rather than the members existing for the family. And this was a real significant departure from the past. After World War II, the male status is really being discussed as a superior status. Compare the essential differences of the Victorian era, right? Where even though men were one way and women were another way, there was no sort of hierarchy. Even if there were social hierarchies, there was not a stated hierarchy within those. This was an attempt to really widen the social gap that had begun to narrow among men and women. And a really interesting parallel might be Northern black attitudes to those of the South during slavery. If you look within the period of slavery at the South, blacks and whites sometimes had some okay relationships with one another in the South, because there was an understanding, at least from the white point of view, that whites were more superior, and therefore they had a lot more security in reaching across cultural and social divides. They didn't have nearly as much animosity, ironically, as the whites in the North did, who were constantly needing to draw boundaries between themselves and free blacks in the North, especially among the poorest of whites. You see, usually the most recent immigrants were typically the most hostile towards African Americans in the North. Younger marriages were also happening a lot right now. Oh my goodness, it's shocked when you look at this picture. Like, the best man, I don't think he's even gone through puberty. He's like this young guy, and the maid, I'm assuming these are the younger brothers and sisters of the bride and groom, but they're so young. Half of women who are 19 years old, and 70% of women who were 24 years old were married. So a lot. If you look at 17 magazine, the magazine you might have read when you were in high school, if you looked at 17 magazines from the 1950s, there's bridal registries, there's how to entertain sort of things, things that are designed for new wives or soon to be some brides to figure their life out. Men got married a little older. 40% of men who were between the ages of 20 and 24 were married. A marriage, again, we had talked about rites of passage and how marriage signaled adulthood. Marriage at this point was a beginning of adulthood rather than a sign that adulthood had already arrived. It was the first step in adulthood. We have higher fertility rates, but less, so people having more kids, but less percentage of marriage was actually spent on child rearing, because people were having their kids much younger and they were living longer, and so their marriage would last longer. And so even though they had more kids, a lower percentage of the time of marriage was actually spent on child rearing. All right, and that brings us to chapter 14, the 1950s, the cultural hegemony of this time. There was a young women's ideal, that as far as many women, what they wanted to marry young, they wanted 4 kids, and they didn't want to work after they became a mom. These ideas were only possible for so many of them, because a lot of women ended up meeting this ideal, because of the booming economy. So dads could go out to work, be the sole provider. This is a father knows best photo too, if you're not familiar. But the men would go out and they were able to provide, even if they had a blue collar job, commanded a much higher wage than it did today. And people could support their family with 4 kids and get a nice house in suburbia for a pretty modest wage. And this is also when we see the first mass consumer economy within the United States. With this booming economy comes, not from this Great Depression where use all you can and whatever you take, you use and save up what you can. There's none of this sort of attitude. That's out the window. It's what can we spend our money on? And there are really, just to look at some of these ads, there's the obviously sexist ones where if your husband finds out you've chose the wrong coffee because it's not going to stay fresh as long, he's going to spank you apparently. There's ones that have sexist undertones but are not nearly so horrific. The one right above that, don't worry darling, you didn't burn the beer. The husband consoling his wife like, don't worry, we don't need dinner, we could just drink beer. Kind of a funny ad. In the lower left corner, you see more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Very odd. And then I put in this, how do you look in your bathing suit? Because it was really interesting that rather than weight loss being a huge body image issue for women at the time, women now, then it was weight gain. People were having trouble putting on weight and getting the curves they wanted. And so there were products that would help you put on weight. Totally different than what it is today. Okay, so we also have this idea that marriage goes from being a good thing to a fun thing. And this is the whole family morality now. Before, family morality was caring for one another, providing for one another, moral instruction, that sort of thing. Now, the family is a fun thing. We want families to have fun and to be fun and to consume and to laugh. And maybe you know families that are like this. We also call this often the American dream, right? We want our 22-foot backyard swimming pool. Drink up, family. It's 7-Up. Come to Florida for summer vacation. This is what it is. We encourage consumption as a moral activity. And so this is where we were. And again, a lot of people were thinking that at this point that all marriages are salvageable. You just have to do the proper gender roles. Yet at the same time, more women were entering the workforce than they were leaving. Even though this idea was the gender roles were being pushed at this point, more working wives than in World War II even, and a 400% increase in working mothers over the decade. And when divorce occurred, it was seen as a failure of individuals, not so much the institution of marriage, right? Okay. And so we've got this wage gap. This shows us how the wage gap has slowly been closing over time. There have been exceptions. The decades from the 60s to the 80s did not fare so well, but the wage gap is slowly closing over time. In 1890, we see that women got about 45 cents to a man's dollar. In 2000, it's about 75 cents to a man's dollar. Depending on a woman's race, it's going to be different. Asian Americans make the closest to white men, followed by white women. Latino and black men have the biggest distance in the wage gap. But yeah, so this is just a kind of a snapshot of this wage gap that we're facing right now. The gap had a pretty significant impact. The large wage gap prevented women from seeing their salary contributions as meaningful, right? Because she made so much less than her husband. So women's employment was just not culturally serious. It was just seen as extras that could provide for fun things for the family rather than anything you'd ever use to put money on a house for and that sort of thing. Women worked more, but still they identified primarily as housewives. Men supported women without a firm sense of patriarchy, not a really rigid, strong iron fist, but they expected good food and pretty wives. As the decade progressed, though, there were more reminders not to let equality get out of hand. Men still had to be the head of the house, and women and men needed to acknowledge this. However, most couples wished to be equal, and a third actually believed that they were. that they were able to meet those ideals that they had. Many husbands also didn't find power in the breadwinner role, but it was something they felt was a burden, and it was a burden that was only made light because of their family's love and care for one another. So you can see there's this unrest, even though there's these cultural expectations of gender distance and gender spheres, people aren't necessarily on board with that. And all of this helped contribute to this illusion of stability. Stability had to do with this unique equilibrium between the economic activities that were going on, political stability, and personal options. So we had this idea that everything was just fine. There was a recurring theme that people kept talking about how much better their lives were than their parents, right? They had the Depression and World War II. This was a pretty low bar, right? That things were really hard in the Great Depression. So rather than looking about what they actually wanted, their dreams and their hopes, they were like, oh, but at least we have all of these things. They saw what they had. And these low expectations ended up contributing to some really miserable existences. For instance, incest was often not believed, and when people made claims of incest. Rape was not taken seriously in any circumstance unless the woman who was raped was a virgin. Wife beating now is coming back and not being taken seriously. And young mothers are pretty unhappy. They feel like there's something more that they should be doing, and they're not quite sure what it is. And there's a lot of strong sanctions as well for out-of-wedlock births. So people would often marrying the person who got you pregnant was the most, or the person you got pregnant was the most typical option, or adopting, moving away to your aunt's house for 3 months and then coming back without a child. So no one ever knew that you were actually pregnant was a way that people would do this. Marriage and adoption were the most common ways of handling out-of-wedlock pregnancies. You could lose your child for an out-of-wedlock birth. You would get illegitimate stamped on the child's birth certificate. It was really terrible and humiliating what they would do to people socially and financially. Abortion or keeping the child was not usually chosen as an option. There was just too many social and economic problem, and with abortion, physiological risks that were involved with that. Okay, so this concludes our second of our history videos going into Kuntz's chapters. So what you could do is I'm going to read the remaining questions that are involved in the second meeting. Here's the first question. This is question 1BQ3. And it is, are you expecting to marry? If not, why not? If yes, what sort of qualities do you hope for in your spouse? Go beyond personality qualities into education level, life goals, and other qualities you deem important. Religion, cultural, political views, whatever it is that you find important. But go beyond nice, kind, funny. Get into some more bread and butter sort of qualities that we can discuss. And our fourth and final question for the second discussion of week 1, question 1BQ4 is, what are the important takeaways for going forward in this class and going forward in your life? And please use this question not only to talk about the videos, but all the material we've covered so far, the Kuntz readings, the Caliph reading, so both of the Kuntz readings and all of the videos. What are the most important takeaways of all of these for going forward in this class and for going forward in your life? Thanks, and I'll see you in the discussions.